In 1955, a woman in Carlton fried zucchini flowers in olive oil, and her Australian neighbour called the fire brigade. She had never seen olive oil before. She had never smelled garlic hitting a hot pan. The Australia these immigrants walked into ate boiled mutton and bread with dripping. There was no basil, no parmesan, no espresso. Between 1947 and 1961, Italians in Victoria exploded from 8,305 to over 91,000. They carried recipes in their heads that would transform this country forever. But before the restaurants came, before Lygon Street became Little Italy, there were meals cooked in tiny weatherboard kitchens that most Australians never saw. Number 14 on this list caused a neighbourhood war. Number 3 was so misunderstood that councils tried to ban it. These are the 25 forgotten Italian immigrant meals of Melbourne in the 1950s. Number 25. Pan cotto, cooked bread soup, was the meal that proved Italian thrift could outdo any Australian housewife. Stale bread, too hard to chew but too precious to waste, went into a pot with water, garlic, olive oil, and whatever vegetables were wilting in the kitchen. Maybe a potato, maybe the last of the silver beet from the backyard. The bread dissolved into a thick porridge-like mass that filled stomachs when there was nothing left in the cupboard. In the villages of Puglia and Basilicata, where many of Melbourne's post-war Italians came from, pan cotto was survival food. Women who crossed oceans with cardboard suitcases recreated this on their first night in a Brunswick boarding house. Australian neighbours peered through kitchen windows, saw what looked like wallpaper paste in a saucepan, and shook their heads. They did not understand that this humble bowl carried centuries of peasant wisdom. Every calorie counted, nothing was wasted, the pot was scraped clean. Number 24, pasta e fagioli. Pasta and beans was the Monday night standard across Carlton, Fitzroy and Brunswick. Dried borlotti beans soaked overnight, then simmered with a ham bone or a piece of pork rind until the broth turned thick and creamy. Short pasta, usually ditalini or broken spaghetti, went in near the end, cooking directly in the bean liquid so the starch thickened everything into something closer to a stew than a soup. A head of garlic, a stick of celery, a tin of tomatoes. That was the foundation. The smell drifted through fibro walls and weatherboard fences, unfamiliar and pungent to neighbours, raised on lamb chops and 3 vegetables. The trick every nonna knew was to mash a ladle full of beans against the pot and stir them back in. That broken starch created a velvety texture no cream could replicate. One batch fed 6 people, with leftovers for lunch. Children who grew up eating this in Melbourne later searched for it in restaurants and never found it made the same way. It was a dish that belonged to kitchens, not menus. Number 23. Frittata di cipolle, the onion frittata. The onion frittata was the Italian answer to the meat pie. A thick wedge of eggs and sweet-cooked onions travelled in a cloth bundle to factory floors and building sites across Melbourne's west. Women sliced onions thin and cooked them low and slow in olive oil until they turned golden and sweet. They poured beaten eggs over the top and finished it under the griller, or flipped the whole thing with a plate. 6 eggs and 3 onions made lunch for 2 working men. Some families added whatever was growing in the garden, a handful of silver beet, a few leaves of parsley, maybe leftover boiled potatoes sliced thin. The frittata was never precious. It was workers' food, practical and filling, served at room temperature between slices of crusty bread. On construction sites in Footscray and Sunshine, Italian labourers unwrapped their frittata sandwiches while Australian mates ate Devon and tomato sauce on white sliced. The Italians were quietly pitied for their strange lunches, but nobody realised they were eating better. Number 22. Polenta e sugo. In kitchens of families from the Veneto, polenta replaced bread. Women stirred coarse cornmeal into boiling water for 40 minutes straight, using a long wooden stick, arm moving in one direction to prevent lumps. Poured onto a wooden board, sliced, and served with a rich meat ragu simmered since morning. The board came out, the sauce pot was carried from the stove. Silence fell for the first few bites. Polenta baffled the neighbours. It looked like porridge at the wrong time of day. Food scientists now know that slow-cooked polenta develops complex starches instant versions cannot replicate. The 40-minute stir was not a chore. It was chemistry. Number 21. Trippa alla Parmigiana. Tripe in tomato sauce with parmesan was Sunday lunch for families from Calabria and Campania. Butchers in Carlton kept honeycomb tripe behind the counter for Italian customers while Australians walked past without a second glance. The women cleaned it meticulously, boiling it twice in fresh water before cutting it into strips and simmering it in a sauce of tomatoes, garlic, celery, and carrot. Hours of cooking transformed the rubbery texture into something tender and silky. A generous shower of grated parmesan finished the dish. The smell was unmistakable, strong and meaty, dividing the street as surely as any fence. Italian children accepted it as normal. Their Australian schoolmates would have been horrified to learn what was on the plate. These women were doing nose-to-tail eating decades before chefs made it fashionable. They were not following trends. They were feeding families on a single income. Number 20. Bacala mantecato. Salt cod whipped with olive oil and garlic was the Friday meal in devout households, where meat was forbidden before the Sabbath. Women soaked dried cod for 3 days, changing the water twice daily to draw out the salt, then poached and beat it with a wooden spoon, gradually working in olive oil until it turned creamy white and spreadable. The dried cod arrived in Italian delicatessens on Lygon Street, wrapped in waxed paper, stiff as a plank and smelling like the ocean floor. Spread on grilled bread or served alongside boiled potatoes, bacala was a dish that connected Melbourne kitchens to fishing villages along the Adriatic. Neighbours complained about the smell of fish soaking in buckets on back porches. Letters were written to landlords, but faith demanded it, and the dish, when made properly, was extraordinary. Number 19. Minestra maritata. Minestra maritata, married soup, got its name not from weddings, but from the marriage of meat and greens in the same pot. Pork ribs, a piece of sausage, maybe a ham hock, simmered alongside escarole, chicory, and cabbage until everything melted into a broth that was both hearty and clean. The vegetables came straight from backyard patches that every Italian household maintained, patches that were a source of wonder and suspicion to Australian neighbours. When children had fevers, they got minestra. When fathers came home cold from night shifts at the factory, minestra. The pot was never truly empty. It just evolved, topped up with water and whatever greens were ready in the garden. First pattern break. Here is where the story turns. While Italian women performed miracles in their kitchens, broader Australia treated their food with open suspicion. Garlic was considered offensive. Olive oil was sold in chemist shops as a remedy for earache, not as cooking fat. At the Bonegilla Migrant Reception Centre in regional Victoria, Italian arrivals were served boiled mutton and tasteless porridge. The food was so foreign that in 1952, frustration erupted into what became known as the Spaghetti Riot. Italian cooks were eventually appointed and given supplies of macaroni, fish, and olive oil. It was a small victory, but it proved that food was not just sustenance for these families. It was identity, and they would fight for it. Meanwhile, King and Godfrey on Lygon Street was one of the first shops to stock Parmesan cheese. Nobody wanted it. So the owner delivered blocks to neighbours and asked them to try it. That quiet persistence changed a city. Number 17. Caponata. This sweet and sour Sicilian eggplant dish became a summer staple when tin roofs turned Brunswick kitchens into furnaces. Eggplant fried golden, combined with celery, capers, olives and tomatoes, sharpened with vinegar and sweetened with sugar. Served cold with bread. Eggplant was one of many vegetables Italian immigrants introduced to Melbourne. Australian shoppers walked past the glossy purple fruit at Victoria Market without a glance. It took 20 years for the rest of the city to discover what Sicilian grandmothers always knew. Number 16. Sardea beccafico. Palermo's stuffed sardines. Sardines stuffed with breadcrumbs, currants, pine nuts and parsley, baked with bay leaves. Women from Palermo bought fresh sardines at the Footscray fish market, butterflied each one with a practiced flick and curled them around a spoonful of filling. A tray cost less than a pound of lamb. Each fish had to be cleaned, boned and stuffed individually. It was work done at the kitchen table while children did homework and the radio played Italian music. When the generation who made them grew old, the dish disappeared. Number 15. Crostata di ricotta. The ricotta tart was the celebration cake of working-class Italian Melbourne. It was made for Easter, christenings, and saints' days, with fresh ricotta drained overnight, sugar, eggs, and candied citrus peel in a sweet pastry shell. The ricotta came from Italian dairymen who delivered door to door at 6 in the morning. You brought your own bowl, and he scooped from a metal pail. When those dairymen retired and supermarket ricotta replaced the fresh product, the tart changed. It was never quite the same. Number 14. Sugo and the Great Passata Day. Once a year, in late February when tomatoes were cheapest at the market, Italian families across Melbourne undertook the ritual of making passata. Crates of Roma tomatoes, sometimes 50 or 100 boxes, were delivered to backyards in Carlton, Brunswick, Coburg, and Reservoir. The entire family worked. Fathers set up the hand-cranked tomato press. Mothers washed and sorted the fruit. Children fed tomatoes into the machine, catching the thick red pulp in buckets, while seeds and skins were discarded. The passata was bottled in recycled beer bottles or preserving jars, sealed with crown caps or wax and stored in the garage to last the entire year. The smell of crushed tomatoes hung over whole streets. Neighbours who were not Italian could not understand the commotion. One Brunswick family in the late 1950s received a council complaint about red splashes on the driveway looking unsightly, but the families persisted because a year's worth of pure tomato sauce, made from fruit picked at peak ripeness, was worth any amount of neighbourly disapproval. That annual passata was the foundation of every weeknight dinner. It was sugo. It was life. Number 13. Melanzane alla parmigiana, not the cheesy pub casserole that Australian menus would later butcher. The real version was an exacting process. Eggplant sliced, salted and pressed under a weighted board for an hour to draw out bitterness. Each slice dredged in flour, dipped in egg, fried in olive oil until golden. Then the layering began. Fried eggplant, a ladle of tomato sauce, torn basil leaves, slices of fresh mozzarella, layer after layer. Baked until the cheese melted and the sauce bubbled at the edges. The dish used extraordinary amounts of olive oil, imported in tins from relatives in Italy, precious as currency. Families guarded those tins. That olive oil went into everything, but Melanzane alla Parmigiana used it lavishly, a sign that this was not an everyday meal. It was a Sunday dish, a feast dish, a dish that said, "We are still who we were." Number 12. Peperonata. Capsicums sliced thick and cooked on the lowest flame for an hour until they collapsed into sweet, jammy submission. No water was added. The peppers released their own juices, reducing into a sauce sweeter than the sum of its parts. Served warm with sausages or cold on bread the next day. Nothing rotted on the vine. Everything reached the table. Abundance was not about wealth, it was about attention. Second pattern break. The Italian backyard in Melbourne in the 1950s deserves its own story, because without it, half these meals could not have existed. While the standard Australian backyard was buffalo grass and a hills hoist, the Italian yard was a working farm. Tomato plants climbed trellises made from bed springs. Grapevines shaded the porch. Fig trees grew against garage walls. Zucchini sprawled across every spare inch. Artichokes blocked the neighbour's light. Some families kept chickens. Council regulations were routinely ignored. Rows of parsley, basil, rosemary, and oregano bordered the paths. The vegetables from these tiny, overstocked gardens were not decorative. They were dinner. And the meals that came from those yards remain some of the finest food ever cooked in this city. Number 10. Salsiccia e friarielli. Homemade pork sausages served with broccoli rabe, that bitter leafy green the Italians call friarielli or cima di rapa, was a winter meal from Campania that transplanted well to Melbourne. Italian butchers in Brunswick and Carlton made their own sausages, seasoned with fennel seeds, black pepper, and sometimes chili flakes. The casings were natural, the meat coarsely ground, the fat ratio generous enough to keep the sausages juicy when grilled or fried. The broccoli rabe was blanched first to tame its bite, then sautéed in olive oil with garlic and dried chili. The combination of rich, fatty sausage and sharp, earthy greens was the kind of pairing that took centuries to perfect. But to Australian eyes, the greens looked like weeds and the sausages were suspiciously garlicky. Italian kids brought leftover sausage sandwiches to school and were mocked for the smell. Decades later, the same ingredients appeared on fine dining menus at 10 times the price and were called artisanal. Number 9. Gnocchi della Domenica, Sunday. Gnocchi was the weekly ritual that bound Italian families in Melbourne together, more than any church service. On Saturday night or early Sunday morning, women boiled potatoes until floury and dry, riced them onto the kitchen table, and worked in flour and egg with their hands until a soft dough formed. The dough was rolled into ropes, cut into pillows, and pressed against the tines of a fork or a wooden gnocchi board to create ridges that would catch the sauce. Speed mattered. Too much handling made them tough. Experienced hands could produce enough for 12 people in under an hour. The gnocchi went straight into boiling water, bobbing to the surface when done, then lifted out with a slotted spoon and dressed with the Sunday ragu, a meat sauce that had been simmering since dawn. Parmesan was grated over the top in quantities that would alarm a modern nutritionist. The table was set with a white cloth, the wine was poured. Everything endured during the week, every factory shift, every slight absorbed, every word of a language not yet mastered was redeemed at that Sunday table. Gnocchi della Domenica was not just a meal, it was the heartbeat of the Italian immigrant week. Number 8. Cotoletta alla Milanese. The breaded veal cutlet, pounded thin, coated in egg and breadcrumbs, and fried in butter until golden and crisp, was the showpiece of families from Lombardy and the Veneto. In a city where the schnitzel was unknown and the closest equivalent was a sad grey lamb cutlet, the cotoletta was a revelation. The veal was beaten between sheets of wax paper until almost translucent, then coated twice for maximum crunch. It was fried in foaming butter until the crust turned deep amber. It was served with nothing more than a wedge of lemon and a few leaves of salad. Simplicity was the point. Good ingredients, handled properly, needed nothing else. The crack of that crust under a knife, the steam rising from the tender meat beneath, was the sound and smell of Italian joy in a Melbourne kitchen. It appeared when there was something to celebrate. A promotion at the factory, a child's communion, or a birthday. Number 7. Bagna Cauda. The hot anchovy and garlic dip from Piedmont was the most socially dangerous dish on this list. Olive oil, butter, garlic, and anchovies were heated until they dissolved into a pungent, salty sauce. Raw vegetables were dipped into the bubbling pot. The smell was volcanic. At Italian social clubs, everyone leaned in, dipping from the same pot, dripping oil on the tablecloth and arguing about politics. It was the original shared plate decades before restaurants invented the concept. Number 6. Zuppa di cozze. Mussel soup cooked in white wine, garlic, parsley, and tomato was the Friday supper for families from Naples and the southern coast. Mussels were cheap and abundant at the Footscray and South Melbourne markets, and Italian fishmongers knew their clientele. A kilogram cost next to nothing. Dismissed by most Australians as bait, Italian women scrubbed the shells, pulled off the beards, and cooked them in a covered pot with wine and aromatics until every shell opened. The broth that gathered at the bottom was liquid gold, salty and sweet with the essence of the sea, stained red with tomato and fragrant with garlic. Crusty bread was torn and dunked until the bowl was wiped clean. The ritual was communal and messy. Fingers were required, empty shells piled into a bowl at the center of the table. Newspaper was spread underneath to catch the splashes. It was loud, physical, and deeply satisfying, the opposite of the restrained knife and fork dining that Australian families practice behind closed curtains. Number 5. Braciole al sugo. Thin slices of beef rolled around a filling of breadcrumbs, garlic, parsley, pecorino cheese, and sometimes pine nuts or raisins, tied with kitchen string, browned and simmered in tomato sauce for hours. The braciole gave their flavour to the sauce, while the sauce tenderized the meat. When the rolls were finally lifted out and sliced, each cross-section revealed a spiral of filling, the pale breadcrumb center surrounded by the dark, slow-cooked beef. The sauce, enriched by hours of simmering with the meat, was served over pasta as a first course. The braciole themselves came second, arranged on a platter with the string removed, 2 courses from one pot. It was the engineering of poverty, designed to make a small amount of cheap beef produce a complete Sunday meal for a large family. Australian butchers had no idea what their Italian customers wanted when they asked for thin, sliced beef for rolling. Some obliged, others refused, insisting the meat would be wasted. The Italian women smiled, took their purchases home and cooked meals no Australian butcher had ever tasted. Number 4. Zeppoli, fried dough balls dusted in sugar or stuffed with anchovy and ricotta. The sweet version marked the Feast of St. Joseph in March. Children hovered, burning fingers on the first batch. At Italian social clubs, they were served with espresso and anisette, lighter inside, crispier outside than any donut. No Australian bakery made them. They existed only in Italian kitchens, and when the generation stopped frying, Zeppole disappeared from Melbourne's streets. Third pattern break. The espresso machine changed everything. Pellegrini's opened on Burke Street in 1954, and the counter was always crowded. Men in hats leaned against the bar, sipping macchiato and reading Il Globo. The coffee culture Melbourne is now globally famous for started in those cramped, noisy cafes, where the hiss of steam was the soundtrack to a community finding its footing. Every flat white poured in this city today traces its lineage back to those Italian espresso bars where no one sat down, because standing was how you drank coffee in Naples. Number 2. Corniglio alla cacciatora, rabbit cooked hunter style, with tomatoes, olives, rosemary and white wine, was a direct transplant from the Italian countryside to the Australian bush. Rabbits were a plague in rural Victoria, shot and trapped in millions, and Italian immigrants recognised an opportunity that most Australians ignored. While farmers poisoned and cursed the rabbits, Italian families collected them, skinned them, and cooked them the same way their grandmothers had in Calabria and Sicily. It was a simple, practical response that turned nuisance into abundance. The rabbit was jointed and browned in olive oil, then simmered with tomatoes, onions, and whatever herbs were growing in the garden. The meat fell from the bone after an hour. The sauce was mopped up with bread. It was a dish that turned a pest into a feast, a perfect symbol of the immigrant ability to see abundance where others saw nuisance. Some families sold the skins for a few shillings, making money and dinner from the same animal. That resourcefulness defined Italian Melbourne in the 1950s. Nothing was a problem. Everything was an ingredient. Number 1. La Festa della Salsa, the Great Sauce Day. Once a year, 3 generations gathered in a single backyard, sometimes 4. Crates of Roma tomatoes were washed, crushed, and boiled down into a thick, fragrant sauce that would sustain the family through the entire year. The tomato press was bolted to a table. The gas burner blazed under a copper pot the size of a bathtub. Children turned the handle. Grandmothers stirred. Fathers sealed the bottles. The sauce was seasoned with nothing but basil and salt, because purity was the point. Each family's passata tasted slightly different, a fingerprint of ripeness and timing and the particular variety of tomato they favoured. The bottles were labelled with the year and stored in rows on garage shelves, glowing red like stained glass. That annual ritual was more than cooking. It was the immigrant calendar made edible. It marked the seasons. It connected the generations. It said in a language that needed no translation, "We are still here, we are still together, and we will eat well." When the last tomato-stained families moved from Carlton to the outer suburbs, and the backyards grew smaller and the children grew busy, La Festa della Salsa began to fade. Some families still do it, but fewer every year. The garage shelves are emptier now, and the copper pot sits unused in the shed. Melbourne lost something when those backyards fell quiet, not just recipes, a way of living that turned food into love and neighbours into family. Find the oldest Italian in your neighbourhood. Ask them about Passata Day. Ask about the gnocchi board and the sugo that simmered all Sunday. Ask before those memories go quiet. These were not just meals. They built the food culture that made Melbourne the eating capital of this country. Every flat white you drink, every wood-fired pizza, every bottle of olive oil in your pantry exists because of women in weatherboard kitchens who refused to surrender the flavors of home. Now you know.